Michelle today. Let her know that. But Stan did a good job this morning, didn't he? And yeah, Stan did a good job. And also pray for Joe. I guess Joe's got COVID. Is that right? Is that right? Joe's got COVID. Quarantine for a couple more weeks. So, all right. Wayne asked me a while ago. He said, "How much time do you want?" And like a good Baptist preacher, I said, "Give me as much time as you can give me." But I trust I won't keep you too long tonight, because I'm reminded of the janitor who was talking to a person in the hallway of the church. And he said, "The blower still works, but the fire's gone out." And the church member overheard them and thought they were talking about the pastor. So I don't want to be like that. Judges, have you found it? Judges chapter 7. And we're looking at just this one chapter tonight. And we're talking about Gideon. And last time we looked at his call. God called him. God came to him. You remember when he was threshing wheat in the winepress. And the Lord said, "I'm going to use you to save Israel from the hand of the Midianites." God is calling people. He is a calling God. And I still believe in the call to the ministry. I still believe in the call to vocational ministry. We don't see a lot of people getting called today, it seems, but God still calls. I think one of the reasons we don't is we don't preach it like we used to. And so I'm trying to stress that a little bit more in my own preaching, my own invitation time to call people to, God calls people into Christian service. I just had a former deacon who was called into the ministry a couple of months ago, and he's older than I am, which I know is young, but still. Sorry, did that choke you up? Okay, water's available. So we're looking at Gideon, and Gideon, you remember Gideon's mentioned in that great Hebrews chapter 11 that we preached on not too long ago. I'll remind you of that. It's you remember in Hebrews 11 it says, "Now faith is the substance of things hoped for and the evidence of things not seen." And it says in the 6th verse of Hebrews 11, "Without faith it's impossible to please God, for he who comes to God must believe that he is, and that he's a rewarder of those who diligently seek him." Then you slip down to verse number 29 of Hebrews 11. It says, "By faith they passed through the Red Sea as by dry land, whereas the Egyptians attempting to do so were drowned." What a miraculous thing that they wall of water, they're backed up to that great sea, and nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. They're at the end of their rope, and God comes through for them and parts the sea. By faith, the walls of Jericho fell down as they were encircled for 7 days. That was a miracle. They just did what God told them to do. Marched around it 6 days once, and on the 7th day marched around it 7 times, and the walls of Jericho fell. They shouted, you remember, blew the trumpet, shouted, and the walls fell. Now, who's getting the glory in those 2 instances? God, right? Not anyone else. God did that. God parted the sea, and God caused the walls to fall down. And by faith, the harlot Rahab didn't perish. In verse 32, "What shall I more say? For the time would fail me to tell of Gideon, and of Barak, and of Samson, and of Jephthah, and of David, and Samuel, and the prophets." And so we're studying about these men and women. Gideon is mentioned there in verse number 32. 1 John chapter 5, verse number 4 says, "For this is the victory that overcometh the world, even our faith." Faith allows us to see the invisible, to choose the imperishable, and to do the impossible. Faith, by faith, by faith. Hebrews 11, by faith. Men and women just like you and I, just like we learned about Elijah this morning. He was a man of like passions like you and I. Nothing special, just a man of God, chosen by God, called by God. And yet, by faith, look at the great exploits that he did. So don't doubt that God can use you. He can. My weakness, His strength is the title that we've given to this sermon tonight. My weakness, His strength. We found this to be true as we walk through the book of Judges, chapter 4 and verse number 8. We see Barak's weakness. God says, and Barak said to Deborah, if you will go with me, then I will go, but if you will not go with me, I will not go. You see, he's a man that's a little timid. He's kind of weak. His faith is weak. And he says, Deborah, if you'll go with me, I'll go, but if you don't go with me, I won't go. God uses weak people to confound the mighty. We see this same thing with Ehud, chapter 3, verse number 15. I don't think I mentioned this to you when we looked at Ehud, but chapter 3, verse 15 says, when the children of Israel cried out to the Lord raised up a deliverer for them, Ehud, the son of Gera, the Benjamite, a left-handed man, and by him the children of Israel sent tribute to Eglon, the king of Moab. And some people believe that term left-handed man means that he was disabled. Disabled. Possibility. God can use disabled people. God uses weak things to confound the mighty. His weakness, my weakness is His strength. And then just before we jump into this chapter, I just want to read for you again a couple of verses from 1 Corinthians chapter 1. 1 Corinthians chapter 1, and here's what it says in verse number 26. Again, just to try to help you to know that God can use you, whoever you are, and however weak you consider yourself to be. 1 Corinthians 1:26, for you see your calling, brethren, that not many wise according to the flesh, not many mighty, not many noble are called, but God has chosen the foolish things of the world to put to shame the wise, and God has chosen the weak things of the world to put to shame the things that are mighty, and the base things of the world, the things that are despised, God has chosen, and the things that are not, to bring to nothing the things that are, that no flesh should glory in His presence. But of Him you are in Christ Jesus, who became for us wisdom from God and righteousness and sanctification and redemption, that as it is written, he who glories, let him glory in the Lord. So that's why God does that. That's why God uses people like you and me, because that way He gets the glory. He gets the glory. All right, so let's look then at the text tonight. And we see, first of all, the soldier's reduction. The soldier's reduction. Judges chapter 7 and verse number 1. Then Zerubbabel, that is Gideon, and all the people who were with him rose early and encamped beside the well of Harod, so that the camp of the Midianites was on the north side of them by the hill of Moreh in the valley. And the Lord said to Gideon, the people who are with you are too many for me to give the Midianites into their hands, lest Israel claim glory for itself against me, saying, my own hand has saved me. Now therefore proclaim in the hearing of the people, saying, whoever is fearful and afraid, let him turn and depart at once from Mount Gilead. And 22,000 of the people returned. 10,000 remained. But the Lord said to Gideon, the people are still too many. Bring them down to the water, and I will test them for you there. And then it will be that of whom I say to you, this one shall go with you, the same shall go with you. And of whomever I say to you, this one shall not go with you, the same shall not go. So he brought the people down to the water, and the Lord said to Gideon, everyone who laps from the water with his tongue, as a dog laps, you shall set apart by himself, likewise everyone who gets down on his knees to drink. And the number of those who lapped, putting their hand to their mouth, was 300 men, but all the rest of the people got down on their knees to drink water. And then the Lord said to Gideon, by the 300 men who lapped, I will save you. I'll deliver the Midianites into your hand. So all the other people, he said, let all the other people go, every man to his place. So the people took provisions and their trumpets and in their hands, and he sent away all the rest of Israel, every man to his tent, and retained those 300 men. Now the camp of Midian was below him in the valley. If you look at your map that I've given you, by the way, everybody has the study sheet tonight. By the way, can we raise this so we can see Jesus? And did everybody get a map? Raise your hand if you didn't get a study sheet tonight. All right, got a few? Right behind you, my wife didn't get one. Anybody else over here? Everybody's got one, okay. If you look at the map, you'll see the spring, in verse number 1, let me just read that verse again. It says, "Then Gideon and all the people who were with him rose early and camped beside the well of Harod." You see that? Verse 1 of chapter 7, "so that the camp of the Midianites was on the north side of them by the hill of Moreh in the valley." Now you have that on the map. If you'll look there, just above the Jordan River, you'll have the spring of Harod. And then just north of that, you'll have the hill of Moreh. But now who's got the upper ground? Who's got the higher ground? It's Gideon. It's Gideon and his people. So that the spring of Harod is higher. As you go in the hill of Moreh, they're in a valley in the hill of Moreh. That's why it says in verse number 9, "I want you to go down against the camp. I've delivered them." Verse 10, "If you are afraid to go down to the camp," because they're down in a valley. All right? That's always good military strategy. If you can get the higher ground, that's a good thing. Well, here we have soldier reduction, reduced by 99%. How do you like them odds? You got 32,000. Now you're down to 300. God says, "I'm going to use the 300 to save Israel from the Midianites." A reduction of your army by 99%. That is an amazing thing. So God tests our faith. I told you that a faith that cannot be tested cannot be trusted. It cannot be trusted. Now, why does God test our faith? You go back to chapter 2 and verse number 20. Chapter 2, verse 20 of Judges. It says, "Then the anger of the Lord was hot against Israel, and he said, because the nation has transgressed my covenant, which I have commanded their fathers, and has not heeded my voice, I also will no longer drive out before them any of the nations which Joshua left when he died, and so that through them I may," what? "Test Israel, whether they will keep the ways of the Lord to walk in them as their fathers kept them or not. And therefore the Lord left those nations without driving them out immediately, nor did he deliver them into the hand of Joshua. Now these are the nations which the Lord left, that he might test Israel by them, that is, all who had not known any of the wars in Canaan." So God does this to show us, to test us, to see whether or not we will obey him. That is, to show us whether or not we're real or whether or not we're counterfeit. And then he does this to strengthen us. So the people had not known war, and so God is going to test them. He's going to give them opportunities to learn war, and he does this then to strengthen. So God tests your faith in order so that you can see, God knows, but you need to know whether your faith is real or not. And then God does it to strengthen us for what lies ahead. Chapter 3, verse number 4, "And they were left that he might test Israel by them to know whether they would obey the commandments of the Lord which he had commanded their fathers by the hand of Moses." That's chapter 3, verse number 4. So it is, God uses trials, God uses trouble, God uses situations to test us, to show us that our faith is real, to help booster our faith, and then secondly, to strengthen us for what lies ahead. God right now is testing you and so to strengthen your faith for what lies ahead. It is good. In fact, it is better to wade in blood at times than to wade in milk and honey. It's better to wade in blood at times than it is to wade in milk and honey. Because God, when you're wading in the blood, when you're going through the trials and the tribulations and the fiery trial that which is to try you, God is testing you and strengthening you. But you're using your spiritual muscles. You're using that faith. You're leaning on God. You're growing in grace and knowledge of the Lord. And God is using that to prepare you for what lies ahead for you down the road. You don't know what lies ahead for you, but God does. See, God sees all things. God knows all things. So he has to help us. Here's a great verse for you. Jeremiah chapter, write this down. Jeremiah chapter 12, verse number 5. This verse is a good verse for you to hear. "If you have run with the footmen and they have wearied you, then how can you contend with horses? And if in the land of peace in which you trusted they wearied you, then how will you do in the floodplain of the Jordan?" Do you see that? God says, you can't handle this right now, but I'm going to send you through some trials and some tribulations that's going to strengthen your faith so that you're going to be able to not just run with the footmen. Man, you're going to be able to keep up with the camels. You're going to be able to keep up with the chariots. You're going to be able to... Look, this doesn't happen overnight. You just don't get down on your knees and you just don't come to an altar and rededicate your life and all of a sudden you walk out of here and you're like, man, I'm ready to conquer the world for Jesus Christ. That's not how it works. You're going to get kicked around. You're going to get bumped around. You're going to get scraped. You're going to get cut. You're going to bleed. It's going to hurt. You're going to wade in blood. But in that process, in those battles, God is strengthening your faith for what lies ahead. So you see the first sifting then that takes place here in Judges chapter 7, verses 1, 2, and 3. The Lord says to Gideon, verse 2, the people that are with you are too many. They're too many. Now just compare that with chapter 5, verse number 23. Curse morose, says the angel of the Lord, cursed be its inhabitants bitterly because they did not come to the help of the Lord against the mighty. So God wanted some more people to help. But here God says there's too many. There's too many for me to give to the Midianites into your hands, lest Israel claim glory for himself. Remember 1 Corinthians chapter 1, I'm going to use the weak things to confound the mighty, so that he that glories, let him glory in the Lord. Lest Israel claim glory for itself against me, my own hand has saved me. See, that's the danger of success. I know far more Christians who are living for Jesus, that are on fire for Jesus, who are going through trials and tribulations, and life is hard for them, and they're clinging on to Jesus, and they're trusting in Jesus. But I know a lot of Christians who are wading in milk and honey, and they're outside the will of God. They're not walking with Christ. They're not on fire for Jesus. Why? Because life's going so good, and man, we've got this, and we've got everything we need, and we just feel like, all of this is happening to me because of the way I'm living. Oh, and you're outside the will of God. No. I was reading in the book of Psalm 73 how that the psalmist said, man, I was envious when I saw the prosperity of the wicked. So everything goes right for them. Everything's going right for them. Even in their death, they die this glorious death. And what am I doing? Why am I sacrificing all of this for Jesus? And the psalmist was having a hard time. He said, until he went into the sanctuary of God. And then it dawned on him, and then he figured it out. You had this first sifting then that takes place. God says, too many people, lest they get glory for it. John Wesley said this, give me 100 men who fear nothing but God, and I will shake the gates of hell. And so they have 32,000. He says, all those that are afraid. Verse number 3, now therefore proclaim the hearing of the people. Whoever is fearful and afraid, let him turn and depart at once from Mount Gilead. And 22,000 of the people returned, and 10,000 remained. Yeah, 22,000 people walked out on day one because why? They're afraid. They're afraid. John Wesley said, give me 100 men who fear nothing but God, and I'll shake the gates of hell. Then you have the second sifting that takes place in verses 4, 5, and 6. The Lord said to Gideon, the people are still too many. Wait a second now. 10,000 against 135,000? And they're too many? It's 135,000. You've got those numbers over there in chapter 8, verse number 10. You got 15,000, then you got 120,000 in 8:10. 8:10. 135,000 people. Gideon, you got 10,000. That's too many. We got to cut them. Reduction number 2. And I will test them for you there, and so it shall be that. And so he brought the people down to the water, verse 5, and the Lord said to Gideon, everyone who laps from the water with the tongue as a dog laps, you shall set apart by himself. Likewise, everyone who gets down on his knees to drink. Now listen, a lot of preaching about the one that laps and the one that kneels down and scoops it out of his hand. Look, it's just God's way of reducing the number. There's no reason for it. Well, this one, is wanting to make sure that, they're watching the enemy while they drink the water. No. At least the text doesn't say that. So all that we can read into this is God just wanted to reduce the number. He takes 300 that drinks the water in a particular way. And the number of those who lapped, putting their hand to their mouth, was 300 men. But all the rest of the people got down on their knees to drink water. So these 300 that brought it to their mouth, God said, those are the ones that I'm going to use. So it's an ordinary experience of life. And in that ordinary experience of life, God's testing them. Now that's amazing to think about. It's just an ordinary thing of life. Even when you're drinking some water, God's working. God's at work. So he that eats or drinks or whatever you do all to the glory of God. God is at work in the ordinary things of life. One day up on Liberty Mountain, 1979, it was snowing. I met a girl in math class. Her name was Doreen. And we went over to, this is so funny, we went over to the copy center. Liberty Baptist College had one copy machine, just like Beulah Baptist Church. Maybe we've even got two, right? They had one. And so she needs the math homework run off. I said, borrow my book. Ordinary thing in life. Fellow student asks you to copy the homework from math that night. Ordinary thing. I go over there, I copy it for her, give her her copy. Well, now we're walking together up in the snow, up to the dormitories where it would now be past Vine Center. And we get all the way up to the top of the hill at her dorm, and she says, I left my gloves in the copy center. I said, I'll be right back. I run down to the copy center, get the gloves, run all the way back up in the snow. See, I did not know she intentionally left the gloves in the copy center to see what kind of a man I was. Ordinary circumstances of life, God is at work, and so was Doreen. Look at not only the reduction, but the right number, verses 7 and 8. And then the Lord said to Gideon, by the 300 men who lap, I will save you and deliver the Midianites into your hands. So all the other people, let all them go, every man to his place. So the people took provisions and their trumpets in their hands, and he sent away all the rest of Israel, every man to his tent, and retained those 300 men. Now the camp of Midian was below them in the valley. So now you have the right number. I'll just give you a couple of verses. You might want to write these down. I'm just going to read them for you. It's 1 Samuel 14:6. This is a good verse. Listen to what it says. 1 Samuel 14, verse 6. Jonathan said to the young man who bore his armor, come, let us go over to the garrison of these uncircumcised. It may be that the Lord will work for us, for nothing restrains the Lord from saving by many or by few. God doesn't need a lot of people. God can use a few people. Here's another verse for you. Write this one down. Deuteronomy chapter 32 and verse number 30. Deuteronomy 32, verse number 30. How could one chase 1,000 and two put 10,000 to flight unless their rock had sold them and the Lord had surrendered them? One can chase 1,000, and God's going to use 300 to whip 135,000 so that he gets all the glory. Now, actually, then, according to that verse, these two verses, 1 Samuel 14:6, Deuteronomy 32:10, all Gideon needed was 27. But God, in his grace and his mercy, gave him 300. He only needed 27, but God gave him 300. So you have this promise in Judges chapter 7 and verse number 7. God says, by the 300 who lapped, I will save you and deliver the Midianites into your hand. Then you have the fulfillment. Look at chapter 8, verse number 28. Thus Midian was subdued before the children of Israel so that they lifted their heads no more, and the country was quiet for 40 years in the days of Gideon. Now, we're going to learn about how God did that tonight. We're going to see it now. But I just want to tell you the end of the story before we get there. There it is. They're going to win. We know how the story ends too, don't we? We've read the book of Revelation. We know how this thing's going to end. Man, I'll tell you right now, during the last 3-4 years, if you just sit back and watch the news, and you don't ever get out, and that's been the case of a lot of people, just stay in and listen to the news, that would drive me nuts. It would drive me crazy, because when you listen to the news, it's all bleak, it's all dark, isn't it? But when you read the end of Revelation and you find out we win, you find out King Jesus is reigning forever and ever, and all the tears are going to be wiped away from our eyes, and there's not going to be any more death, and there's not going to be any more sorrow, no more pain, and we're going to be walking on streets of gold. Whew. I'm telling you, that's great. So you have now the sign from the Lord in chapter 7 and verse number 9. Let's pick up in verse number 9. So it happened, we just have the details here in verses 9 through 12. It happened on the same night that the Lord said to him, "Arise and go down against the camp, for I have delivered it into your hand." Now notice the tense of the verb. I have delivered it into your hand. They hadn't won the battle yet, but in God's eyes they had. The same thing he said back in chapter 6, verse number 2, when the Lord said, back in Joshua chapter 6 and verse number 2. Here's what the Lord said about Jericho. And the Lord said to Joshua, "See, I have given Jericho into your hand, its king, its mighty men of valor." I have. And they hadn't yet, but God says I have. I love that. That's what faith is. It's taking God at His word. He says, I want you to go down against the camp, since they're down there in the valley. It's actually north of them, and it's on the hill of Moreh, but it's down. I want you to go down to the camp with Purah your servant, and you shall hear what they say, and afterward your hand shall be strengthened to go down against the camp. And then he went down with Purah his servant to the outpost of the armed men who were in the camp. Now the Midianites and the Amalekites, all the people of the east, were lying in the valley as numerous as locusts, and the camels were without number as the sand by the seashore in multitude. Wow, you've got this vast army. They're all laying out there, and the camels are innumerable, the people are innumerable, but God gives Gideon this assurance, you're going to win. 3 times God told him he was going to have victory. He tells him in 6:14, he tells him in 6:16, he tells him in 7:7. This is the 4th time God says to him, you are going to win the battle. Arise, go down to the camp. I have delivered it into your hand. 4 times God said to him, you're going to win. But guess what? And not only that, God's already given him 3 signs. 3 signs. He had the fire from the rock. Studied that last time. He had the wet fleece. He had the dry fleece. So God's told him 4 times. God's told him 4 times, I'm guaranteeing you victory. God gave him 3 signs, but Gideon needed more. So God's going to let him, he's heard it from the mouth of God 4 times. Now God's going to let him hear it from the mouth of the enemy themselves. Watch verse 13. When Gideon had come, there was a man telling a dream to his companion. And he said, I've had a dream. To my surprise, a loaf of barley bread tumbled into the camp of Midian. And it came to a tent and struck it so that it fell, and it overturned, and the tent collapsed. And his companion answered and said, this is nothing else but the sword of Gideon, the son of Joash, a man of Israel. Into his hand God has delivered Midian and the whole camp. And so it was, when Gideon heard the telling of the dream and its interpretation, he did what? He worshiped. 4 times God says, I'm giving you victory. 3 times God gives him a sign. Fire from the rock. Wet fleece. Dry fleece. Now from the mouth of the enemy himself, he goes down to the camp and he listens in and he hears a Midianite telling a dream to another Midianite about this loaf of barley crashing and tumbling down onto a tent. And he says, this is none other than the sword of Gideon. This is none other than the sword of Gideon. Now remember that, the sword of Gideon. Now, is God gracious or what? Here in Hebrews 11, we read about the faith of Gideon. But Gideon needed God to strengthen his faith. So here's what the Bible says about our God. Hebrews 4:14, seeing then that we have a great high priest who's passed through the heavens, Jesus, the Son of God, let us hold fast our confession. Do not have a high priest who cannot sympathize with our weaknesses. My weakness is his strength. Your weakness is his strength. We don't have a high priest, he says, that cannot sympathize with our weaknesses, but was in all points tempted as we are, yet without sin. Let us therefore come boldly to the throne of grace that we may obtain mercy and find grace to help in time of need. Need a little more assurance about the goodness of God and the grace of God and his patience with you and with me? Here it is, Psalm 103, verses 13 and 14. As a father pities his children, so the Lord pities those who fear him, for he knows our frame. He remembers that we are dust. Now listen, everybody will have an opinion of you, but the only opinion that matters is God's opinion of you. And God's opinion of you is you are his child, you are special, he loves you, he's got his hand on you, he's testing you, he's trying you, he's strengthening you for what lies ahead. You keep your eyes on Jesus, you look to Jesus, the author and the finisher of your faith, because he's not disappointed in you. Other people may be disappointed in you. God's not disappointed in you. Are you hearing me tonight? God is not disappointed in you. You say, but I nothing. There's not a person in here tonight that's not as weak as I am. And there's no one in this auditorium tonight who's a worse sinner than I am. There's nobody in this auditorium tonight who can get discouraged and get disappointed with this one that I shave in the mirror every morning. All right? But I'm telling you, your heavenly Father in heaven is not disappointed with you. And he is up there, and he is encouraging you, and he's praying for you, and he's a great high priest. He sympathizes with all your weaknesses, and God wants to take that weakness, and he wants to use you in spite of your weakness. Your weakness is his strength. Let him have you. Let him have all of you. Surrender it all to him, because that's who God uses, is a surrendered man, a surrendered woman, not a perfect man, not a perfect woman, not a person who can say, I have arrived, but a person who's going through the valley, who's wading in the blood, and God saying, I'm strengthening you because I'm going to use you even greater degree in the future. So here's this dream. God gives Gideon yet another sign. From the lips of the enemy, he hears it. Now, barley, he says, here's the dream. A loaf of barley bread tumbled into the camp of Midian. You see that in verse number 13? It's the grain that was primarily used by poor people. Again, it symbolizes weakness. Weakness. The grain used by poor people. Who's God use? God uses weak, humble. We sang it this morning. Beautiful songs that we sang this morning about humility. Humility. That's who God uses. Humble yourself in the sight of the Lord, and he will exalt you in due season. God uses that kind of people. Question, do we have a lot of boasting today in our society? Do we have a lot of conceited people in society today? We do, don't we? Verse number 15, so it was when Gideon heard the telling of that dream, boy, he worshiped. He worshiped. God gave him exactly what he needed when he felt like Lord, you can't use me. You can't use me. I'm so weak. 300 people against 135,000. But wouldn't that do something for your faith if you went down there and you overheard somebody telling a dream? And he said, that's the sword of Gideon. And they're afraid of you, just like Jericho was afraid of Israel. Now, we have the sound of victory in the remaining verses. You see the strategy, first of all, verse 16. Then he divided the 300 men into 3 companies, and he put a trumpet in every man's hand with empty pitchers and torches inside the pitchers. And he said to them, look at me and do likewise. Watch, and when I come to the edge of the camp, you shall do as I do. And when I blow the trumpet, I and all who are with me, then you also blow the trumpets on every side of the whole camp. And they said, and say, the sword of the Lord. You ever read that magazine? The sword of the Lord, John R. Rice. The sword of the Lord and of Gideon. So here's a strategy. It's a brilliant plan. It's a brilliant plan. It negates the size disparity. Because when they see this, when they hear 300 trumpets and when they see 300 lights, they're going to think there's this massive army coming against them. It's a brilliant plan because it negates the size of disparity. It's a brilliant plan because it negates the difference in strength. These men have camels. All you have are footmen. It's a brilliant plan because they're going down to the enemy when they're at their weakest. They got their jammies on, all right? It's night-night. It's night-night. And they got their jammies on. So God rewards faith. He gives to Gideon wisdom. And now, guess what? The doubts are gone. The fear is gone. Verse 15, notice the difference of Gideon. Arise, the Lord has delivered the camp of Midian into your hand. He's not down in the winepress now, fearful. He's got this courageous faith. God's been working on him. He's working on you. And he says, we got this. We got this. We've got it. Well, finally, he got it. Lord told him 4 times. God gave him 3 signs. Now he's heard it directly from the mouth of the enemy. But finally, he's got it. He's got this amazing courage. And he says, God's got this one. I'm telling you, God's got this one. So they're going to blow this shofar. Got one on the back table back there. They're going to break a jar. It's going to reveal the light. And they got this torch that they're going to burn. So this is a good leader. You know who a good leader is? A good leader is one who is a growing leader. He grows from chapter 6, verse number 13, to chapter 7, verse number 15. Chapter 6, verse number 13, he says, if the Lord is with us, why has all this happened to us? Where are all of his miracles which our fathers told us about, saying, didn't the Lord bring us up out of Egypt? Now the Lord's forsaken us and delivered us into the hand of the Midianites. You come over to this chapter and he says, guys, God's got it. We're going to win. That's a good leader, a growing leader. God takes a Simon and he turns him into a Cephas. He turns him into a rock. That's what God's wanting to do with you. He's wanting to grow you. He's wanting to help you become a rock. You've got the sound in verses 19. Gideon and the 100 men who were with him came to the outpost of the camp at the beginning of the middle watch, just as they posted the watch, and they blew the trumpets. They broke the pitchers that were in their hands. And the three companies, all 300, blew the trumpets and broke the pitchers and held the torches in their left hands and the trumpets in their right hands for blowing. And they cried, the sword of the Lord and of Gideon. And every man stood in his place all around the camp, and the whole army ran and cried out and fled. The blowing of that trumpet, the shouting, the lights all of a sudden. God not only gave him wisdom, God gave him courage. And these people assume they're being attacked by a large army, and they panic. They hear a great noise. They see a great blaze. They hear a great shout. And remember, they've all been thinking, we're in trouble. The sword of the Lord. This one guy's dream was probably in every tent. They're all fearful. God's been working. So you have this final 3 verses, the summons. And so when the 3 trumpets, verse 22, when the 300 blew the trumpets, the Lord set every man's sword against his companion throughout the whole camp, and the army fled to Beth Acacia toward Zererah, and as far as the border of Abel-Meholah of Tabbath. And the men of Israel gathered together from Naphtali, Asher, and Manasseh and pursued the Midianites. And Gideon sent messengers throughout all the mountains of Ephraim, saying, "Come down against the Midianites and seize from them the watering places as far as Beth-Baran of Jordan." And all the men of Ephraim gathered together and seized the watering places as far as Beth-Baran the Jordan. And they captured the 2 princes of the Midianites, Oreb and Zeb, and they killed Oreb at the rock of Oreb. And Zeb they killed at the winepress of Zeb. And they pursued Midian and brought the heads of Oreb and Zeb to Gideon and all on the other side of the Jordan. So God gave wisdom and courage. God gave him an opportunity here in these verses to enlarge his army. You had 300, that's great. Now I'm going to let you. So he's calling for volunteers. Been taking the staff through Billy Graham's leadership book. Good leaders have to do 2 things. You've got to be able to get volunteers, and you have to be able to raise money. You got to. Why? Because the work of God takes money. This is what Billy Graham says in his leadership book. You have to be able to rally volunteers, and you have to be able to raise money. Did you know this church takes money to operate? You know, it takes money to cut the lights on. It takes money to pay the water bill. It takes money to, we're always doing something around here, aren't we? Replacing a roof, fixing a door. Always something to be done. And so, thank God we have good leaders in this church who are able to do that. You've got a good finance committee, you got a good personnel committee, you just got a whole lot of good committees. Billy Graham turned Hollywood down, he turned presidents down. He knew his mission would not succeed without economic vitality. I just want to say this in closing. I hope that you will give every week a certain amount to the multipurpose building, because I'm going to tell you we're going to need it within a year. You're going to need it within a year. And God's able to provide it. You say, well, that building we're planning on building, we can do it in phases. We don't have to do it all at once. I believe we could do probably one phase for about $750,000. And if we had twice what we have right now, we could build it. We could break ground. In 1 year's time, we're going to be busting at the seams. We're going to be wishing we had space. God's going to provide that building. Folks, I walk around this property and I'm praying and I'm telling you that building is there. You don't see it, but it's there. It's there. It's coming. I believe God. Do you? And I'm asking you to give. I'm asking you to give so that Beulah Baptist Church will have nice facilities, wonderful facilities, a nice, large building for fellowship and for ministry. This was a day that Israel would never forget. You believe that? It's a day Israel will never forget. We need more days like that. Our God says He'll give us the desires of our heart. God doesn't need large numbers. He just needs people that are available. Father, thank you for this story about Gideon. God, that you're strengthening our faith. You're calling us, and you're preparing us for what lies ahead. And I thank you that you walk with us through the valley. I thank you that you go with us through the fire, that you're that fourth man in the fire, that you're there. I pray for everyone that's here tonight that's either in a fire or they're just coming out of one or they're getting ready to head into one. And I'm asking you, Lord, that you would strengthen them tonight for that and help them to solidify in their heart tonight, I'm going to live by faith. I'm going to believe God. I'm going to trust God tonight. And I don't know why, and I don't know all the answers to all my questions, but tonight I'm going to trust God. And I'm going to pray, God, would you put your hand on me? Would you use me again? God, you take broken vessels. You take jars of clay. We have this treasure in earthen vessels, and I thank you that you use weak people and you use people that are just Cephases, but you turn them, just Simons, but you turn them into Cephases, you turn them into stone. You're molding and you're making us. Help us to be available to you, Lord. Do the great and the mighty things that you want to do here at Beulah Baptist Church in the years ahead, I pray. In Jesus' name, amen. Let's stand together for our closing verse of a hymn. You want to sing a verse, Wayne? Just a cappella or something? Sound good?
Hey, PJ. Oh, there we go. Thank you, PJ.